The order to fire was given in the same tone a clerk uses to close a ledger. Warden Talvith Sir did not raise his voice. He never had to. From the command tier of the Undiminished, he watched the little station bloom on the forward glass, a cluster of glass domes and grow lamps turning slow against the dark, and he logged what he saw, the way he had logged 1,000 worlds. Before it, assessment negligible. He said the words aloud for the recorder, and the recorder took them, and the guns did the rest. The domes came apart without drama. That was the part younger officers never understood. They expected the enemy to fight back to matter. And when a target simply broke and went quiet, they felt cheated. Talvith felt nothing so wasteful. He felt the small satisfaction of a hallway swept clean. The station had answered. No hail. Flown. No banner. He recognized. Sat in a system. His charts marked as unclaimed rock and ice. By the standards of the Third Reach, it had asked to be catalogued. And he was cataloging it. Kepler's Rest, the station had called itself in a burst of language. His translators only half caught. A name for a place to lie down. He noted that too, because he noted everything, and because a careful record was the only monument a warden of the Sethran Dominion left behind. Somewhere in the wreckage, a signal was still crawling outward, thin and stubborn. A distress call flung at a sky that belonged to him. He let it go. Let it reach whatever cousins. These small creatures kept. Cousins did not frighten a fleet. The signal reached someone. He would only understand that later when understanding was the one thing he had left. In the moment, there was just a soft flag on his sensor tier. A contact where his charts promised nothing. Close. Closer than close. Had any right to be. Not approaching. Already there. A ship the size of a mountain range holding station at the edge of his formation. As if it had been waiting for him to finish, and had watched the whole thing, and had decided, for reasons he could not read, not to interrupt. His board had no entry for it. He checked twice. In 40 years of service, Talvith Sir had never once filed a contact. He could not name. Far from that place, in a room that smelled of cold coffee and machine oil, a woman named Nadia Roan watched the same signal come home. Coordinator was her title, though. The word did too little. She sat at a table scarred by years of elbows and set down mugs. And when the automated ping resolved into a name, she went very still. Kepler's Rest. 19 years that station had been growing things that were never meant to grow, feeding a colony that had no business surviving, and it was gone between one breath and the next. She did not shout. She reached for the roster. Across the room, a man was already reading it over her shoulder. Captain Idris Marsh had a face that gave up nothing, and a pen he had carried since before. The war had a name, an old thing from Earth, with the maker's mark worn smooth. He found the entry he was looking for and touched it once. Tomas Vega, 51 years old. 19 of them spent on his knees in borrowed soil, coaxing the first orchard anyone had ever raised that far from the sun. A daughter listed beside him, Sasha. Marsh did not say a word about any of it. He took a clean sheet, and he uncapped the pen, and in a hand too plain to be called elegant, he began to write a letter to a man who might already be dead. One so far, he said to no one. Roan looked at him. One what? Letter. He did not look up. There'll be more. On the command tier of the Undiminished Warden, Talvith composed himself and did what a professional does with the unknown. He measured it. The vessel refused. Every hail refused, even the courtesy of a threat display, and simply held its distance and its silence. He requested a mass reading and received a number that his instruments plainly did not believe because they offered it 3 times, each time the same, each time with the little error flag that meant the machine wished someone else would decide whatever the thing was. It was heavier than it should be able to be, and moving when it chose to move, as though weight were a rumor. It had heard about other ships. He filed his report to the Concord table with the discipline of long habit, and he ended it as he ended everything with the 2 words that had made his career. Assessment unchanged, a single unidentified vessel, non-hostile posture, presumed native, presumed harmless. He believed it when he wrote it. That was the thing he would turn over in his mind for the rest of his life. He had believed it The Concord table received his report the way it received all reports from the frontier, which was to say barely. High above the Dominion's ringed capital in a chamber built to make 100 species feel small, Overseer Vesicorin let the frontier scroll past her and did not slow for the flag on Talvith's contact. She had swallowed larger mysteries than one silent ship. She had watched 300 first contacts across her tenure, and every one of them had ended the same way, with the young and the loud folded quietly into the body of the Dominion. Their names kept their fleets absorbed, their pride filed under history. A species that has never lost a war, she said to the counselors, who bothered to attend, is not a strong species. It is only a species that has not yet met us. There was a scatter of the sound. The Sethran made in place of agreement. Log the vessel. Absorb the system. If the little gardeners want it back, they may petition. No one, at the table, wrote down the word gardeners. It would have been useful later to know who first decided that a people who grew things could not also break things. But the Concord table kept careful minutes of everything except its own contempt. In the room that smelled of oil and cold coffee, the letter grew to 19 pages, because there were 19 names on the last verified crew list of Kepler's. Reston Marsh was writing one for each. He did not write eulogies. He wrote small true things. That Tomas Vega hummed off-key when he pruned, that he had brought a single fig cutting through 2 evacuations, wrapped in a wet cloth against his chest. Roan watched the stack thicken and understood dimly that the captain was doing a kind of arithmetic. She had no name for counting something out into the dark, and that when the count was finished it would land somewhere on someone with the weight of every page. They took them alive. Roan said it quietly. She had the transponder logs now, and the logs were worse than death in their way, and better. Most of them, the station's a loss. The people aren't confirmed lost. They pulled them off before they fired. Marsh set down the pen. For a moment, he only looked at the 19 pages, and something moved behind the flat calm of his face, and then settled away. Water settles over a stone. You have just dropped and cannot get back. Hostages were not the dead. Hostages were a door still open. And a man who had spent 2 years teaching himself not to hope did the small, dangerous thing of hoping. Then I'm writing the wrong letters, he said. He gathered the pages, squared them, and set them aside, unfinished. Get me Longview. The order that crossed the dark next was not loud either. Longview, a Titangent-class hull that the Sethran board would insist for another 3 chapters, was too large to exist, eased out of its silence, and did the one thing Talvith Sur had not prepared for. It spoke, not in weapons, not in warning. It opened a channel on the warden's own command. Frequency uninvited, as if his codes were a lock left hanging open. And it addressed him by his rank and his name. And it asked in a voice as level as a man reading a grocery list for the safe return of the people of Kepler's rest. Talvith's hand hovered over the recorder. The report was already written, assessment unchanged. He found he could not quite bring himself to file it. The channel stayed open between them for a long time, and neither ship filled it. Talvith Sur had negotiated with 40 species across his career, and he had learned that the first one to speak after a demand is the one who has already begun to lose. So he waited. He let the silence stretch, let it press on the human vessel, and he watched his boards. For the small tells of a bluff, the power fluctuations, the nervous course, corrections, the shiver a ship makes when the crew inside it does not believe its own posture, he found none. Longview held its station with the patience of a landmass. When at last a voice returned across the link, it was not the captain's. It was the same flat request repeated word for word, as if the first asking had simply been mislaid. He decided to learn something. Before we discuss your gardeners, he said, choosing the overseer's word, on purpose testing it, you will identify your class and your tonnage. Standing protocol. I do not bargain with a vessel. I cannot file. There was a pause that he wanted to read as hesitation. Then, the human captain answered him directly, and the answer was almost gentle. You already can't file me, Marsh said. That's the part you keep coming back to. As for tonnage, a breath, the sound of a man deciding not to bother lying. Enough is not a number. No, Marsh agreed. It isn't. On the human side of that link in the room with the scarred table, Roan put her hand over the microphone and looked at the captain like he had just walked out onto ice. He's asking how big the stick is. That's a real question. If we tell him nothing, he assumes we're small and pushes. If we tell him the truth, he panics and does something we can't take back. With the hostages still aboard his flagship. So we tell him neither. Marsh had picked the pen back up without seeming to notice. He was writing again, small and steady, in the margin of a fuel report, because it was the paper nearest to hand. Big fleets brag. It's the only thing they know how to do with their size. When we don't brag, it costs him something. He has to wonder why. Why what? Why we're not afraid of him. He capped the pen. How many now? Roan did not have to ask what he was counting. She glanced at the growing column of names in his hand, the ones he had started for the dead and was now keeping for the living. A page begun for every soul the logs said had been pulled off Kepler's rest breathing. 22 confirmed, she said. They keep resolving as the telemetry cleans up. There'll be more. Then there'll be more letters. He set the fuel report on top of the stack, squared the whole thing, again, out of habit, and turned back to the dark. 22 so far. Aboard the undiminished Warden, Talvith did the responsible thing with a mystery he could not solve. He escalated it upward and filed it flat. His report to the Concorde table was a model of composure. 1. Unidentified Titangent-class vessel refusing standard disclosure, making a recovery demand regarding the natives of the seized system. Posture non-hostile. No offensive action taken against Dominion assets. He weighed the ending for a moment, longer than usual, the two words sitting ready, and then he wrote them, because a warden who changed his assessment on the strength of a strange feeling was a warden who did not stay a warden. Assessment unchanged. He believed it a little less this time. He filed it anyway. The Concorde table, when the report reached it, did what large bodies do with frontier noise. It routed the matter to procedure. Overseer Vesa Corin did not even bring it before the full chamber. She issued a standing instruction through the ordinary channels, the kind that generated no debate and no minutes worth keeping. And the instruction was a single word, dressed up in 3 sentences. Routine. The vessel was to be seized under salvage authority. The natives, if any survived, were to be processed under absorption statute. The warden was to increase patrol density in the 3rd reach and report at the ordinary interval. Increase patrol density. It was the phrase the Dominion reached for whenever it did not want to admit. It had noticed something. Corin had signed it 1,000 times, over 1,000 small unknowns. And every one of those unknowns had in the end obliged her by staying small. She signed it now and moved to the next item. And the next item was a tariff dispute, and the tariff dispute felt more real to her than the ship at the edge of Talvith's formation, because the tariff dispute could be resolved, and the ship so far had done nothing at all. Doing nothing was Longview's whole argument. Talvith was beginning against his will to understand that. He decided to make it do something, not an attack. A test, the sort a careful officer runs, to convert a mystery into a measurement. He ordered a targeting sweep, a hard active lock, the aggressive LiDAR pulse that any warship in the galaxy would read, as a hand moving toward a weapon. He wanted to see it flinch. He wanted a power, spike, a shield, bloom, a hail full of sudden diplomacy. Anything that would give the thing a shape he could put in a box. The sweep went out, and Longview answered it in a way that emptied the warmth out of him. It did not raise a shield. It did not power a weapon. In the fraction of a second between his pulse leaving the undiminished and its return, the human ship reached back down the beam and rewrote his own targeting solution. His lock did not fail. It simply quietly reassigned itself, and when his officers tried to reestablish it, the system reported that it was already locked perfectly on a point 11 kilometers off Longview's bow, a patch of empty space the human vessel had apparently decided his guns should be aimed at instead. It had not jammed him. Jamming, he understood. It had taken his hand in its own and moved it gently somewhere harmless and let go. The whole exchange lasted less than a breath. No one on his tier spoke. The junior officer at the sensor station looked back at Talvith with an expression the warden had seen exactly once before, on a soldier who had put his palm flat on a hull plate and felt through the metal something on the other side put its palm against the same spot. "Log it," Talvith said. His voice did not shake. He was proud of that later, in a bitter way. "Contact demonstrates active countermeasure capability, non-lethal. Precisi." He stopped. The two words waited. He could not make himself reach for them. "Leave the assessment field open," he said instead. And that small surrender, that one blank field in a career of filled ones, was the first honest thing he had entered into the record since Kepler's rest. Then Longview spoke again, and it was the captain's own voice, this time unhurried, using Talvith's rank. And his name, the way a man uses the name of someone he intends to remember. "Warden Talvith Sur." A pause. Not for effect, just a man letting a hard thing be heard. "You have 22 of my people aboard your flagship. I know the number because I've been writing to them. I would like them back, alive, and soon, and in the order you took them, so I can stop keeping the list." Talvith looked at the blank assessment field. He looked at the mountain holding station off his bow, the thing his instruments still insisted was too heavy to move, and moved anyway. The thing that had reached into his ship and set his own guns down, without breaking them. He thought about the word Corin had used gardeners, and about the word she had not written, which was the true nature of the people who grow things that they are patient past. All reason that they will kneel in the dirt for 19 years for a single tree, that patience of that kind is not softness at all but the hardest thing a species can be made of. "And if I do not return them," he asked. He needed to hear the answer. He was a careful officer to the last. "Then I keep writing," Marsh said. "I'm good at it. I've had practice." The channel closed from the human side, politely the way a door is closed by someone who does not need to slam it, because he has already shown you he can open yours whenever he likes. A careful officer denied certainty reaches for force, because force turns questions into answers. Talvith Sur was a careful officer. He did not commit his whole fleet. That would have looked like fear, and fear was a thing he still believed he did not feel. He detached a third of his screen, instead 40 attack craft, under his best squadron leader, and he sent them out, not to destroy Longview, but to swarm it, to crowd it, to make it show him the shape of what it would do. When a real number guns came close, he wanted the mystery to blink. It did not blink. It sorted them. He would use that word in his mind for a long time afterward, because no other word fit. His 40 craft came in fast and clean, a textbook envelopment, the kind of maneuver that had ended 100 first contacts before a single shot was needed. And Longview watched them come, the way a man watches rain arrive across a field. There was no scramble. There was no panic burn. The human ship simply began in the calm middle of their approach to take them apart. And the taking apart was the gentlest violence Talvith had ever witnessed. His lead craft lost its main drive between one instant and the next, not blown off, not burned, just switched off. Some line of code reaching in and telling the engine it was finished for the day. The two on its wings found their weapons cold in their mounts. A whole flight discovered that their targeting had been reassigned as his own, had been to empty patches of the dark, and that no amount of overriding would bring the guns back to bear, because the guns no longer believed there was anything in front of them worth shooting. In under 2 minutes, his 40 attackers were drifting whole, unhurt, their crews alive, and furious, and utterly harmless, spun out across the void, like seeds shaken from a pod. Not one of them was destroyed. That was the message. Longview could have made ash of all 40, and had chosen instead to embarrass them and let them live. And the choosing was somehow worse than the ash would have been, because ash is what you do to an enemy, and this was what you do to a child who has reached for the stove. On the command tier, no one filled the silence. The junior officer at Sensors said without being asked in a voice gone thin, "Warden, there are more of them, more attack craft, more like her." The officer's hands moved over the board, as if he could scrub the reading away. "The vessel is broadcasting now, openly, not to us, to its own. And the traffic pattern," he swallowed. "It answers to a formation. There are at least 40 hulls of that class already crewed, and underway, 40 Warden, that we can see. Forte." Talvith held the number, very still in his mind. The way you hold a blade, you have just realized, is sharper than you thought. One such ship had set down his entire screen without raising its voice. The Dominion counted its strength in the hundreds of thousands. And by that arithmetic, 40 was nothing. 40 was a rounding error. 40 was a patrol. But the arithmetic assumed that each of those 40 was a ship, a thing that could be counted and matched and eventually outnumbered, and some cold new part of him had begun to suspect that this was exactly the mistake. The calm voice on the channel had been waiting patiently for him to keep making. He sent the reading up the chain. He did not soften it. And this time at last, the Concord table looked. Overseer Vesikorin brought the matter before the full chamber, though she brought it the way a strong swimmer walks into cold water, unhurried, refusing to admit. It took her breath. She let the counselors watch the recording of 40 Dominion craft going quietly dark, and when the muttering rose, she cut through it with the certainty that had carried her for 300 years. One ship, she said, achieving surprise once against a screen that was not expecting it. This is the oldest story in the galaxy. The clever ambush, the lucky blow. Every species we have ever absorbed had exactly one trick, and every one of them believed the trick was destiny. She let her gaze move across the chamber. 40 of these vessels, they say. We have 40,000. Increase the pressure. Send a real force, not a patrol's leftover screen, and let us see how the trick performs against weight. It cannot lift. There was agreement, because there is always agreement, when a powerful person offers a frightened room permission to keep believing what it believed yesterday, but not all of it. One counselor, an old logistician who had spent her life moving fuel and food across the Dominion's vast body, did not make the sound of agreement. She asked a question instead quietly, and the question went into the minutes and was ignored, and it was the only sentence spoken at the Concord table that day that history would find worth keeping. Where the logistician asked, "Are they building the other ones?" no one answered her. Corin moved to authorize the larger force, and far out on the frontier in the room that smelled of oil and cold coffee, the column of names in Idris Marsh's hand crossed 30. 33, he said when Roan asked. He did not stop writing. The letters had changed as he wrote them, though he had not planned it. The early ones had been for the dead, careful and final. These were for the living, and a letter to the living cannot help but hope. And so each page had a small future folded into it, a thing he would say to that person when he got them back, a joke, a debt, a seedling. He owed them. He was not writing eulogies anymore. He was writing arrivals. Idris. Roan had been watching the fleet feed the slow-motion humiliation of 40 enemy craft. The enemy overseer's speech relayed and translated a half-beat behind. She looked older than she had an hour ago. They're not going to stop. He set 40 of theirs adrift without a scratch, and she's calling it luck. She's sending more. I know. You wanted her to. Marsh finally looked up. I wanted her to see it and stop. She saw it, and she's doubling down. That's not the same. But it's what we've got. He set the pen down and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for exactly one breath. And then he was calm again. The flat calm. That was not indifference, but the opposite of it. A man holding something so heavy that any tremor would drop it. When the big force comes, we do it in front of the whole council on an open feed. So there's no version where it stays a rumor. They took a garden full of people who couldn't fight them. Let the entire Dominion watch what that buys them. And nobody dies who doesn't have to. That's the line. We hold it, even when it costs us. And if holding it costs us the hostages. He did not answer quickly, because it was the true question, and the true question deserved the courtesy of his fear. Then I finish the letters. The other way, he said at last, and I make sure every one of them costs her 100 years. But we hold the line first. If we stop being the kind of people who hold it, there was no point being the kind of people they should have left alone. Out on the undiminished warden Talvith Sir sat before an open recorder and could not fill the assessment field. He understood now what the human ship had been doing to him from the first moment, and the understanding sat in his chest like swallowed ice. It had never been fighting him. It had been offering him a choice over and over, in a language of restraint he had been too proud to read. Every time it set down his weapons without breaking them, every craft, it spun out alive, every number it declined to give him. It had been saying the same patient sentence: "You do not have to keep doing this." And he had kept doing this. He had sent 40 craft. He had passed the reading up the chain, knowing what Corin would do with it. And Corin was going to send more, and more would go dark. And somewhere, a man with a pen was writing a page for every soul caught between the two of them. He set his hands over the recorder controls. Assessment. The field prompted. The word he had ended every report with for 40 years waited under his fingers, worn smooth as a coin, unchanged, unchanged, unchanged. He opened his mouth to say it, and for the first time in his life, the words would not come out whole. The real force came the way. An empire always sends its real force, which is to say as a statement rather than a plan. 6,000 hulls under a battle marshal named for the number of worlds. His line had folded into the dominion arrayed in the old crushing sphere that had ended civilizations before humanity had a word for the sky. Corin sent it on an open feed exactly as she wanted it seen, so that every counselor and every client species watching from 100 systems would witness the trick, meet its weight, and break. She got her open feed. She simply did not understand until it was over, whose broadcast it had become. Talvith watched the sphere assemble around Longview and felt something he had no professional word for. His whole life, the arrival of that formation had meant the argument was finished. Now he watched it close on the single human vessel, and he found he was not waiting to see whether the human ship would survive. He was waiting to see how it would decline to. There is a particular dread in being the one person in a cheering room who already knows the score. On the human side, Roan read the count aloud, because someone had to. 6,000 give or take. Battle Marshal's colors. Idris, that's not a fleet, that's a demonstration. She wants an audience. She looked up. She's going to get one. How many of ours are up? Marsh asked. He was not writing now. The pen lay capped on the fuel report, on top of a stack of pages grown thick as a book. Everything in the reach. And the yards just cleared. Another tranche. Roan pulled the number, and it did something to her voice. 206. Idris. 206 hulls of Longview's class, laid down and crewed since Kepler's rest. Since 6 weeks. They built 206 of them, while she was calling us a lucky trick. Marsh took that in without expression. And then he said, the thing that mattered, the line he would hold no matter what it cost. Then we have more than enough to do this softly, open the feed on their own frequency. If the whole galaxy is watching her, prove her point. The whole galaxy watches us, prove ours. Nobody dies who doesn't have to, especially not today. Today, least of all. The sphere finished closing. 6,000 guns found their marks. And in the half-second before the battle marshal gave the order that would have made him immortal, Longview and the ships that had gathered quietly at the edge of the dark, while everyone counted the enemy, instead began all, together, to take the Dominion's grand fleet apart. It was not a battle. Talvith, who had seen battles, knew at once that he was watching something else, something with no name in his language. And he understood dimly that the absence of a name was the whole point. There was no exchange of fire because only one side fired, and it fired at nothing, its solutions reassigned mid-launch to empty patches of the black, the way his had been. 6,000 ships reached for their weapons, and found the weapons reaching back, powering down, going cold, forgetting the concept of a target. Drives quit. Reactors idled themselves to a hum. The great crushing sphere, the shape that had ended civilizations, simply stopped being a sphere and became 6,000 drifting rooms, full of soldiers who had not been hurt and could no longer do a single thing they had come to do. It happened across the open feed. That was the part Corin would never forgive and never recover from. She had chosen the broadcast, so the galaxy could watch the trick fail. Instead, 100 systems watched the Dominion's answer to everything. Its weight, its 6,000, its immortal marshal be set down as gently and as completely as a parent takes a knife from a toddler's fist, not destroyed, disarmed, alive, and whole, and utterly publicly unable, which is a thing. An empire can survive, being told in private, and cannot survive, being shown to its clients. The battle marshal named for the worlds his line had eaten, gave the order to fire 3 times, and 3 times the fleet did not, could not. And on the 3rd time, the sound he made was not an order at all. On the command tier of the undiminished warden, Talvith Sir watched the largest force he had ever seen become the largest silence he had ever seen, and he did the only true thing left to a careful officer. He counted 6,000 hulls adrift, none ablaze, not one plume of atmosphere venting, not one lifeboat blooming from a broken flank. In 40 years, he had never seen a fleet action end without a single wreck, because there had never been one, because the entire logic of a fleet was that meeting one cost you ships. The humans had rewritten the logic. They had made the meeting cost the enemy nothing but the truth about himself, and they had made him pay it in front of everyone he had ever ruled. His officers were looking at him. They wanted the assessment. It was his to give. He turned to the recorder. The field waited the way. It had waited for 40 years, and he found that the 2 smooth, worn words were simply gone, fallen out of him, somewhere, back around the 40th drifting attack craft, and what was left in their place was a truth. He had spent his whole career being paid not to write. He did not write it yet. Not quite. Because across the link on the human captain's own frequency, still open, still broadcasting to 100 watching systems, the calm voice returned. It did not gloat. It did not raise itself even a little. It simply began in front of the entire Dominion to talk about the 22 people still held aboard the Undiminished, and about the letters, and about what was going to happen next. Warden Talvith Sur. The captain used his name again, in front of 100 systems, and made it sound like an address between equals rather than a sentence passed on a prisoner. You have 22 of my people aboard your flagship. I'd like them back now, all of them breathing in the order you took them. And then I'd like to tell you what we're not going to do, because I think it matters that you hear it out loud. Talvith did not trust himself to answer. He gestured, and his officers did the thing that a day ago would have been unthinkable, and now was the only sane act left in the ship. They brought the 22 up from the hold. Farmers, mostly. A teacher. 2 children who had been asleep when the guns came and had not fully understood, even now, that anything had happened to them beyond a long, strange trip in a cold room. Tomas Vega walked at the front of them, 51 years old, still cradling against his chest, a fig cutting wrapped in a wet cloth because he had refused across 6 weeks of captivity to let it go, and no guard had thought it worth the trouble to make him. They were put aboard a shuttle. The shuttle crossed the dark, unhurried, unescorted, and Longview opened to receive it. And on the human feed, you could hear faintly the sound a room makes when people who thought they were lost walk back into it. That's the part I wanted the galaxy to see, Marsh said. His voice never lifted. Now, here's the rest of it. Every one of your 6,000 ships is going home. Their crews are alive. We took nothing from them but the argument. You burned a station full of people who couldn't fight you, and you held children in a cold room for 6 weeks, and you called it routine. We could have answered that in kind. We had the means. We have in fact more means than you have let yourself imagine. A pause, and into it. He laid the number flatly, the way a man sets down the last card. There are 844 hulls of this class in our yards right now. More tomorrow than today. That is not a threat. It is the reason the threat is unnecessary. We do not have to destroy you to be safe from you. We only have to keep building. And you cannot make us stop. And we will not stop being the kind of people who chose the shuttle over the ash. You chose to burn a garden full of people who could not fight you. We chose to send your crews home. Those are not the same choice. And I need you to understand that we made ours on purpose. 844. Talvith heard the number climb its stairs across the acts of that long day, 40 and 206. And now this, and understood at last that the humans had never once told him how strong they were. They had told him how fast they became stronger. A fleet, you can count. He had counted fleets his whole life. But the thing that laid down 200 more hulls in the 6 weeks, it took an empire to feel insulted. The thing that answered a massacre by building instead of burning, and then declined to use what it built. That thing could not be counted, because by the time you finished the count, it had made the count wrong. He looked at the drifting, 6,000. He looked at the shuttle safe, now folded into the mountain of a ship that had never once needed to hurt him. And he turned to the recorder, and this time nothing waited under his fingers, because the two words that had ended 40 years of reports were finally completely gone. Far away in the room that smelled of oil and cold coffee, Idris Marsh set down his pen for the last time that day and squared the stack of pages one final time. Roan came and stood beside him and looked at the thick book of letters, one for every soul taken from Kepler's rest, and she watched him go through them, and she understood the arithmetic. Now the count she had never had a name for. He had written a page for every name. He had read the number out loud through the whole long fight won so far. 2233, keeping the tally, out into the dark. And the Empire had heard a man counting, and assumed he was counting ships, because ships were the only thing the Empire knew how to be afraid of. It had been counting people the entire time. It had been building a case, name by name in a hand too plain, to be called elegant for exactly what those people were worth, and exactly what it would cost anyone who forgot. 41, Marsh said quietly, and set the last page on top. 41 letters for 41 souls, and every one of them was going to be delivered by hand, because every one of them was alive to receive it. He had started the count for the dead. He got to finish it for the living. That was the whole of what the day had been about, and the 6,000 drifting ships and the 844 in the yards were only the noise around the edge of it. You can stop keeping the list now, Roan said. No. He capped the pen and slid it into his breast pocket next to nothing over his heart. I keep the list. That's the point. That's the thing. They can never build, and can never break, and can never count. I just get to change what it's a list of. He looked out at the quiet fleet, 6,000 rooms full of soldiers going home, to tell their families a story. Their overseer would spend the rest of her life trying to bury. Get me the conquered table, whatever's left of it that's willing to talk. It's time somebody over there wrote down the word. She wouldn't. Aboard the undiminished Warden, Talvith Sir bent over the recorder with the whole watching galaxy still listening, and began slowly in the blank field where the smooth-worn words used to live to write the truth. There is no form in the Dominion for what Warden Talvith Sir wrote that day, because the Dominion had never needed one. Every report ends with an assessment, and every assessment is a judgment. A strong species passes on a weaker one, and for 40 years his had ended the same worn way. He sat now with the field open and the galaxy listening, and he wrote instead of a judgment, a confession. He wrote that a Titangent-class human vessel had met his screen and set it down alive, that it had met 6,000 hulls under a battle marshal and set them down alive as well. That across a full day of what any officer would have to call a war, the enemy had not killed one Sethran soul and had returned 22 of its own that the Dominion had taken, and had told him plainly, and in front of everyone, that it possessed the means to do far worse, and had declined. He wrote that his instruments could not file the human ship, because the humans were not the sort of thing his instruments had been built to fear. And then because the field still waited, he wrote the sentence he had spent his whole career being paid never to write. Assessment revised. We were wrong about them from the first hour, and I helped us stay wrong. He filed it. And, because the feed was still open, the whole Dominion read it as he wrote it. The Concord table came apart over that report, not in fire, but in the slower way that matters more, the way a family comes apart when one member finally says out loud the thing everyone had agreed not to name. Overseer Vesakorin stood in the chamber, built to make 100 species feel small, and tried for the last time to make the room feel large again. One officer's nerve, she said, is not a strategic reassessment. He was outmaneuvered, and now he is frightened. And a frightened officer will always mistake his own fear for a fact about the enemy. She had carried 300 years on the strength of exactly this, the ability to make certainty out of nothing, and she reached for it. Now, the way a swimmer reaches for a bottom that is no longer there. They set our fleet adrift. Very well, they did not destroy it, because they could not. And a species that cannot finish its enemies is a species we will finish at our leisure. Increase the. She stopped, because she heard where the sentence was going, and so did the chamber. Increase the pressure, increase patrol density. The phrase she had signed 1,000 times over 1,000 small unknowns, and every unknown had obliged her by staying small, and this one had not. And now the phrase itself had become the evidence against her. It hung in the air, with all its old emptiness, suddenly visible, the way a word repeated too many times stops meaning anything and becomes only a sound a frightened person makes, and the counselors looked at it, and looked at her, and the old logistician who had asked where the humans were building the other ones did not have to ask anything at all. She simply let the silence answer. Into that silence, the human channel opened, because Idris Marsh had asked for the table, and the table, or what was willing to speak of it, had answered. He did not appear in triumph. He appeared as a tired man in a room that smelled of oil, a stack of pages at his elbow, and he spoke to the chamber the way he had spoken to Talvith, all along level, and without hurry, as though the size of his audience did not change the size of the truth. "I'm not here to take anything from you," he said. "I'm here so you understand why you can't take anything from us. And so we don't have to keep having this conversation with your grandchildren. So I'm going to tell you the thing your overseer wouldn't write down, and I'd like someone in that room to write it down this time." He let that sit. Then he said the thing, and it went into the minutes, and it became the sentence that 100 client species carried home and repeated in their own tongues for a generation. "You counted our ships," Marsh said. "That was the mistake. A ship can be counted. You can match it, outnumber it, wait it out. But you were never fighting the ships. You were fighting the thing that builds them. And that thing was building faster, the angrier it got, and you made it angry by burning a garden. Here is what I need you to write down." He leaned in just slightly, the only large gesture he made in the whole exchange. "Species that grow things are the most patient species there are. They will kneel in the dirt for 19 years for a single tree. And a species with that much patience does not get discouraged. It gets to work. You did not meet a strong people. You met a patient one. The second kind is worse for you, because the strong ones tire, and the patient ones only count. No one at the table made the sound, the Sethran, made in place of agreement. But the old logistician wrote it down. That was enough. That was in the end all Marsh had wanted, one hand in one chamber setting down in the permanent record. The thing the Empire had been too proud to see, so that it could never again be unseen. The terms that followed were almost anticlimactic, and that was by design, because Marsh understood that a peace which humiliates is only a war with a longer fuse. The humans demanded no territory. They demanded no reparations. They could not have built themselves in a season. They demanded exactly two things: that the Dominion write the Kepler's Rest attack into its own permanent record, in its own hand as a massacre, and not a cataloging, and that from this day the Third Reach be charted on Sethran maps, as claimed and inhabited, so that no careful officer 40 years from now could ever again look at a cluster of glass domes and grow lamps and log the word negligible. It was mercy shaped like an insult, and it was accepted because the alternative was 844 hulls and more tomorrow than today. And because somewhere in the chamber, the certainty that had ruled for 300 years had quietly gone out, the way a fleet had gone out all at once and without a wreck. Warden Talvith Sir was not in the chamber. He was on the command tier of the Undiminished, watching the shuttle logs, because he had asked to see them, and no one had the standing to refuse him anything now. He watched the 22 cross back into the human ship. He watched the manifest resolve name by name into a column that matched exactly a column he had glimpsed once across the link in a man's plain hand. He understood finally and fully what the count had been. The human had been reading him a list the whole time, not of ships, of people. And every number the human had said out loud, every one so far, and 22 and 33, had been a page. The human was refusing to let anyone forget. And Talvith had heard a man counting his strength, when in fact he had been listening to a man counting his dead. And then when the door opened, counting his living instead. He looked at his own report, the confession he had filed, and he thought that he would spend the rest of his career trying to write the way that human wrote plainly about small true things, and that he would never manage it, because you cannot learn in one day, the patience it takes to kneel for 19 years, and that this, precisely this, was the whole of what the day had taught him. In the room that smelled of oil and cold coffee, Idris Marsh reached the end of the list. He had 41 pages. He delivered 40 of them by hand, or by the nearest thing to a hand, that the dark allows a shuttle, and a name read aloud, and a person stepping forward to take what was written for them. 40 souls, 40 arrivals, 40 small futures, folded into 40 plain letters, and handed back to the people they belonged to. He watched Tomas Vega take the fig cutting still against his chest, and read the first line and put his hand over his mouth and say nothing, because some things do not need to be named to be felt. The 41st letter was for Sasha Vega. She had not been on the station when the guns came. She had been in transit, a supply run 3 days out and helpless, and she had spent 6 weeks, not knowing whether the list she was on was of the taken or of the dead. Marsh had started her page in the first hour, when he still thought he was writing eulogies, and he had not finished it because he could not make himself write the end of it. Either way, he had carried it unfinished through the whole long day, the one page in the book, with no last line, and now he sat with it in front of him, and the pen uncapped, and did not for a moment know what future to fold into it, because for the first time the future was real. And standing in the doorway, Sasha Vega came home to a station that was gone. The domes were wreckage. The grow lamps were dark. 19 years of borrowed soil. The first orchard anyone had raised that far from the sun. All of it broken and drifting and cold. She stood in the empty greenhouse frame, the glass gone, the dark pouring straight through where the light used to be caught and kept. And she did not weep the way you would expect a person to weep. She knelt. She put her hands in the ruined soil the way her father had knelt for 19 years, and she found in the wreck of the first orchard that the soil was still soil, and that soil does not know it has been through a war. Her father crossed to her with a fig cutting wrapped in a wet cloth, held against his chest, and he knelt beside her, and without a word, he put it in her hands. That was the last line Marsh had been waiting for. He wrote it at last, in the 41st letter, in a hand too plain to be called elegant, not an ending, a thing he owed her, and now could pay. He wrote that the garden was not the glass, and was never the glass. He wrote that they would plant it again, and that it would take years, and that years were the one thing their people had always had more of than any empire, because an empire spends its years ruling, and a gardener spends hers waiting. And waiting, it turns out, is the harder and the stronger of the two. He capped the pen. He slid it into his breast pocket over his heart next to nothing. 41, he said. Delivered. And the list, which the Dominion could never build, and never break, and never count, went quiet in his hands. Not finished, only changed the way a garden goes quiet in the winter, while it decides patiently in the dark, exactly how it means to come back. The human ship left the way it had come without ceremony. One moment, the mountain held station off the Undiminished's bow, and the next it was easing back into the dark, unhurried a landmass, deciding to be elsewhere. And Warden Talvith Sir stood at the forward glass and watched it go and did not log a single word. He had thought in the first hour that he was watching a mystery he would solve. He understood now that he had been watching a mercy he had very nearly failed to receive. All that long day, the human ship had held something back, and he had assumed the thing held back was force more guns, a hidden fleet, the killing blow saved for the right moment. He had been wrong about that, the way he had been wrong about everything else. What the ship had held back was not its power, it was its verdict. It could have decided at any point that the Dominion was the kind of thing that had to be ended, and it had chosen instead to decide that the Dominion was the kind of thing that could still be taught. That was the blow it had kept in reserve. That was the cage it had chosen not to open. And Talvith, who had spent 40 years cataloging weaker species so that stronger ones could absorb them, understood that he had spent this single day being cataloged in turn by a people patient enough to look at an empire that had burnt a garden full of children and file it not under enemy but under not yet. He went back to the recorder. There was a report to close. For 40 years he had ended them the same worn way, and the worn words were gone, and in the blank place where they used to live, He wrote one last line, and then closed the file for good. The third reach he wrote is claimed and inhabited. It always was. We simply could not read the language. Its people wrote in. He did not sign it. Assessment unchanged. He would never sign anything that way again. He sat for a while after an old careful officer in a quiet ship and thought about how you learn to read a language you have spent your life too proud to hear, and concluded that you do not learn it in a day, and that the not learning was itself the first honest lesson. In the room that smelled of oil and cold coffee, Idris Marsh finished for the day. The great fleet was gone home, 6,000 rooms full of soldiers who would spend the rest of their lives telling a story their overseer wanted buried. The 844 hulls sat in the yards, and more were being laid down, even now, because the yards did not stop. The yards never stopped, and that was not a threat. It was only the truth about a patient people, that an empire had learned the expensive way. But Marsh was not thinking about the hulls. He had stopped thinking about them the moment the last shuttle docked. He took the pen out of his breast pocket, the old thing from Earth, with the maker's mark worn smooth, and he looked at it, and he set it in the drawer, where he kept it between counts. "You did it," Roan said. She was tired in the way that comes after fear leaves hollowed out and light. Whole thing open feed, and not one wreck. "Nobody's ever done that." "We'll have to do it again," Marsh said. "Not them. Someone. There's always another Concord table that hasn't heard yet." He closed the drawer. "But not today? What do you do now?" He thought about it, and the answer was so ordinary that it took her a moment to understand it was the whole point. "I've got 41 people back," he said. "One of them owes me a game she never finished. One of them promised me figs. I'm going to go collect." He stood, and the flat calm that had frightened a warden and broken a council was up close. Just the steadiness of a man who has carried something heavy a long way and finally gets to set it down. That's the part they never believe about us. They think the ships are the point. The ships were never the point. The ships are just what we build, so we can get back to the part that is. He went to collect his figs. On what was left of Kepler's rest, the light came back, one lamp at a time. Sasha Vega did not wait for the domes to be rebuilt. There were no domes yet, only the frames, the bones of the greenhouses, with the dark pouring through, and she worked inside them anyway in a pressure suit, under a sky that had no business being breathable, and would be in time because breathable was a thing her people made, rather than found. She knelt in the borrowed soil that did not know it had been through a war. She took the fig, cutting her father had carried against his chest through 6 weeks of a cold room. The one thing in all of it he had refused to set down, and she put it in the ground. It was a small thing to do in the ruin of 19 years. It was, in fact, the only thing worth doing, and she knew it the way her father had known it, the way their whole patient people had always known it. You do not answer the loss of a garden by grieving the glass. The garden was never the glass. You answer it by kneeling down and starting the years again, because you have. The years, you have always had more years than any empire, and an empire spends its years ruling, and a gardener spends hers waiting. And in the long arithmetic of the dark it is, the waiting that wins. Her father knelt beside her. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed naming. Far above them, a warden in a quiet ship was learning to read a language he had been too proud to hear, and a captain was putting a worn pen in a drawer and going to collect on a promise about figs, and a council was writing down at last in its own hand the word it had refused to write. And here, at the bottom of it all, where the whole day had really been about the entire time, 2 people put a single cutting into ruined soil and covered its roots and pressed the earth down gently with their hands. The cutting would take years. That was fine. Years were what they had. It would not look like much for a long time, a bare stick in broken ground under a frame with no glass, and anyone flying past who counted such things, who logged the strong and catalogued the weak, would look at it and see nothing worth a second glance. That had always been the mistake. It was the first mistake, and the last one. The one an empire made from its high chamber, and the one a careful officer made over his recorder. The failure to understand that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy does not look dangerous at all. It looks like a person kneeling in the dirt. It looks like patience. It looks like someone who has lost everything, deciding quietly without a single word of threat to simply begin again, and to keep beginning for as many years as it takes until the thing they are waiting for finally, inevitably comes back into the light. Sasha Vega stood and brushed the soil from her hands and looked at the small planted thing in the great, ruined, dark. Then she went to find more water. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and that, in the end, was the whole of what made them what they were.